Thank you, Rob, for a stimulating presentation. You leave us with an appetite for more information. So I'm hoping that our next speakers can address some of the questions. So the next session is current cybersecurity in cybersecurity and trends is a migration to the cloud. And in order to address that, we are fortunate in having Cox Communication indeed. The session will be conducted in a question and answers mode. Please prepare your questions. We look forward to having some questions from the audience as we reach the end of the session. Let me quickly introduce the speakers. You, of course, know that their bio sketches are in the booklet. First, in the order of presentation, is Matt Carothers, and he's Senior Principal Security Architect. He has a lot of experience in security architecture. He is one of the leaders in Cox Enterprises. The second one is Tomás Montilla, and I note that Tomás is a graduate of the University of Georgia, but also a graduate of my home college, the Scheller College of Business, where he received his MBA. He spent 6 years as a security consultant with some Fortune 500 and some state government agencies at PwC. And then last but not least, indeed, is Dobbs, Manager Cloud Security. Blake has been a cloud security leader at Cox Communication. He has worked in the reduction of risk across all manners of platforms, and he has specialized in security automation. I note also that Blake spent some time at Georgia Tech Research Institute, where he worked in an applied research and development lab. He's a recipient of both his undergraduate and graduate degree in business management, business administration at Georgia Tech. And he's a certified information system security professional. That credential is known as CISSP. We'll revisit that in a later session when we talk about training. So we're very pleased to have all three of you gentlemen to field some of the questions. So the first question I would like to raise, it really is a basic one.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a small presentation, a company overview from Cox.
We do indeed. So first will go to the presentation to overview Cox Enterprises and Cox Communication. So a company overview. And who is going to do the presentation actually?
I guess Cox team will do it. Matt?
I'll actually go ahead and give the presentation. That's fine. I'll let you guys know when to move to the next slide. So,
okay, right. Good.
Professor McIntyre, thank you so much for the introduction, and to everyone on the call. Pleasure being a part of these sessions and being a panelist. We appreciate the invites. With that said, since we know some of you guys may not be familiar with our organization, this will be a general overview. I'm happy to field and answer any questions you guys may have after the fact. But Cox Communications is a privately owned subsidiary of our parent company, Cox Enterprises. We have a sister division, Cox Automotive, which it's a holding company for many products and services you guys may be a little more familiar with, such as Auto Dealer, Auto Trader, Philly Blue Book, etc. Cox Enterprises also funds and serves as capital for many sustainability initiatives, as the ones you have seen here. It's also a very active contributor in the tech scene for many startups here in the Atlanta market as well. And finally, for Cox Communications, you'll see that we have multiple divisions. The main ones you'll see obviously would be our residential services, Cox Business, and Cox Media. So we can move on to the next slide. So fairly quick, brief history of some of the major milestones of our organization. We were founded in 1898 by Governor James N. Cox. He was a governor of the state of Ohio, and actually he ran for presidency back in 1920 as part of the Democratic Party with FDR as his running mate. In 1962 was the time when we entered our main bread and butter service and offering, which is the cable television industry. And then in 1993, we expanded to providing B2B services, and that's when we entered the Cox business space, with which we're still in today. In 1997, we then became the first MSO to deploy the digital cable bundle. And then in 2023, we continue being a key player in the ISP space. We have entered new markets, new verticals, and continue supporting a lot of different initiatives, whether it be philanthropic as well as in the digital and like we mentioned, venture capital space as well. So we can move on to the next slide. So in general, we are the largest US privately owned broadband provider. That makes us actually the third largest cable television provider in the nation. We operate out of multiple markets, with our largest presence really being on the West Coast, although we do also have presence in the Central and Midwest markets as well, as well as some markets on the East Coast. We have $20 billion worth of investments in the last decade in our network infrastructure, as well as product upgrades. And then 13 billion plus in annual revenue, around 6.5 to 7 million total customers that we service. Our main categories are going to be in the internet space, video, mobile, phone services. As of earlier this year, we had our nationwide rollout of our Cox wireless service, so Cox Mobile. And we also have multiple managed services. And as far as our workforce right now, we're servicing around 18,000 employees throughout the nation. Again, our residential services mostly really on down to internet and cable services for your typical household. We have B2B as well as new ventures, which all roll up under Cox Business. And then Cox Media really is our advertising sales wing, which is multi-channel. So cool. And I think that about wraps up that initial presentation. We can now pivot a little bit over to our Q&A. So.
Thank you, Thomas, for an enlightening presentation on a very significant footprint across the broadband related industries. So it's against that background that I raised the question, given the exposure that you probably sustained to various cybersecurity risks, what are some of the more significant salient threats that you have experienced most recently in the industry sectors you have identified? And that goes to all three of you, given the cumulative experience and expertise you bring to bear on the question.
I'll go first on that one. When you ask most people what the worst cybersecurity problem is, most of them would say ransomware. But if you look at the numbers, business email compromise actually has at least double the losses of ransomware and probably more. I would categorize that as one example of social engineering, which is really the broadest problem. No matter what technical safeguards we put in place, the human is often the weakest link. So with business email compromise, there's a lot of money being lost around the world. And it's a very cruel sort of crime because it's supported by a lot of other crimes. So for example, the BEC actors, when they want to cash out a large bank account, they can't just transfer the money directly to their own account. They have to launder it through a bunch of smaller accounts. And to do that, they maintain networks of hundreds of thousands of money mules, often people who are victims of romance scams, people who think that they're in a long-term relationship with a loving remote partner, but it's just a criminal somewhere, convincing them to open fake bank accounts and transfer money around and things like that. So top threat for us is definitely social engineering in general, and I'd say BEC in specific.
That's very insightful, having myself been a victim of what you call social engineering regarding 3 of my bank accounts. Could you expound a little bit on the notion of social engineering and how it's a key to basically a scheme of fraud that is multi-layered?
Yeah, absolutely. The core tenet of social engineering is pretending to be someone you're not in order to convince your victim to do something that they really ought not to do. It might be as simple as sending out some text messages, pretending to be the CFO and trying to get some iTunes gift cards or something. Or it might be something as complex as a multi-layered scheme in order to get the CFO to wire hundreds of thousands of dollars off somewhere. As an ISP, most of the social engineering attacks we see are actually targeted at our customers rather than ourselves. We get a lot of threat actors who call up trying to pretend to be a customer in order to take over some aspect of that customer's account, usually so that they can pivot somewhere else. Cryptocurrency, of course, is a strong target. If you hold a bunch of cryptocurrency, you should definitely make sure you have multi-factor authentication, and you should make sure that you're not using SMS as that second factor, because bad guys are actively targeting people known to have cryptocurrency, calling up their ISP or their wireless carrier with all of the information that they need in order to reset a password or to get a phone number swapped over to a different SIM card in order to break into that crypto.
How easy is it to break into a SIM card? We all have smartphones in our pockets. Mine was broken into 3 times.
Yeah.
Cox is not the service provider.
In this case, Cox does have a mobile service, but we're an MVNO with another provider. So how easy it is just depends on how good the attacker is, and to some degree, it depends on who your mobile provider is. The attacks against SIM cards range from, just somebody calling up tech support at the mobile provider to someone actually walking into a retail store, grabbing a tablet that an employee is using in order to actually perform customer operations and running out of the store with that tablet. It's a complex operation. It's not just one dude. It's like 4 or 5 people working in conjunction. You'll have one guy whose whole job is just to run in the store and grab the tablet. You'll have another guy whose job is to hold the burner phone and wait for that number to show up. Another guy whose job is to attempt to log into your account to generate that multi-factor code to the burner phone. Another guy whose job is to cash out the crypto once they get it. So it's a whole operation and not just lone wolves.
Thank you, Matt. I'm wondering if Blake or Thomas have other input into that question of foremost cybersecurity threats.
Yeah, and well, actually, just piggybacking on the example that Matt was giving here with SIM swap, the other thing to keep in mind, right, is a lot of the times we also have what is called supply chain risk, right? It won't be just your organization that will be responsible for the protective controls, but you also need to have strong partnerships with the vendors, right, who are maybe supplying the devices and may be responsible for remediating things like zero-day vulnerabilities that may facilitate, right, some of those, let's say, risks of SIM swaps or other vulnerabilities that might be present, right? So a lot of the times, in order to mitigate some of those issues, what you need to have is a strong program that conducts due diligence on them, as well as, again, a strong partnership where we're able to either identify on your own and then quickly respond to the issues by getting in contact with the vendor, or having the vendor notify you, right, of the issues themselves and then bring it to your attention. So.
Blake, have you experienced a different range or set of threats in your own field, particularly with reference to cloud security?
So yes, and the answer is both. Yeah, I mean, we from the cloud perspective, we have to worry about the pivoting that Matt was alluding to, more so than like the business email compromise from our side. But the pivoting in cloud can just really escalate and hasten the attacker's ability to exfiltrate data, right? And so we have to really do our due diligence to make sure that we are monitoring normal behaviors, understand what our kind of patterns look like, and report when those are changed. And then on the other threats, just because the nature of cloud, everything is public by default in cloud. So we deal with a lot of both kind of, I would say, nation state attackers and script individuals and automation just continuously trying to poke holes in all the public APIs, also to try and pivot, right? I mean, they're just trying to get find ways in, find ways to connect back into our corporate data centers and exfiltrate kind of what we would consider crown jewel data. And because of the nature of public cloud, it can be a little easier because everything's on the internet. Everything's public APIs and things like that. So we spend a lot of time and energy making sure that those things are put behind effective security controls and monitored effectively.
Are the losses potentially great in terms of your divisions at Cox?
Yeah, I mean, both from losses and impact could be, it just depends. But I mean, I think probably the biggest impact for us that the team here values the most is really the impact to the brand. The data and the customers is certainly something we want to protect, but I think the Cox name and the Cox, the goals and the belief of Cox and the brand is what we really want to make sure we uphold to the best of our ability, right? So the data is something we certainly try to protect every day, but holistically, the Cox name, the family, and the brand is what we're trying to protect too.
In terms of the magnitude of a potential loss, does anyone want to add a remark or an observation? Or
Matt may can have some more historical knowledge as to like amounts, et cetera, but I know in our cloud environments, we have petabytes of data, and just that amount is scary just in the names, right? And so some of that data maybe is not as sensitive as others, but that impact could be very broad if we don't do our jobs effectively.
Just curious, are there
Tying the
risk
cost to a
insurance?
breach is one of the big unanswered questions in cybersecurity, I would say, because it's not just the monetary value of the data. Like Blake says, there's brand reputation to think about. There's the cost of cleanup. If we're bringing in some high-level firm to help with the cleanup, we're paying through the nose for that. You have to account for the time that even your employees spend on cybersecurity and that cost. And so it's difficult, I would say, if not impossible, to put an actual dollar figure. Certainly not one that you could generically apply to other companies as well.
Yeah, I do understand. And then there's the cost of opportunity as opposed to, if you have to protect yourself every step of the way, then how much of your resources are devoted to a defensive process. We all talk about the rise of AI, generative AI. Does that change the domain? Does that change the landscape in terms of cyber threats and how you cope with them, anticipate them, prevent them, and perhaps reduce cost?
Yes. AI makes everything worse. I'm sure it'll make some things better too, but think back to those social engineering attacks. And a lot of times you can spot the email because the grammar is wrong, or they use weird turns of phrase that an American wouldn't actually use. But now we essentially have a universal translator that's going to translate whatever into properly formatted English with whatever local colloquialisms make it seem effective. So in the short term, just improving social engineering is going to be a problem. Medium term, we're looking at things like being able to copy someone's voice. So if you were to be able to copy someone's voice and then actually make a phone call instead of a text message, spoofing your CEO's phone number in order to get those iTunes gift cards or whatever.
Or your financial advisor.
Yes, exactly. Longer term, I think we'll see deepfakes being more of a problem. Today, deepfakes are difficult to create because it takes a lot of processing power. You can't do it in real time. And there are artifacts that show up that make it fairly easy to spot. But eventually, we will live in a world where you can real-time deepfake a video of someone. So you could be on a Zoom call with someone who looks and sounds like your CEO, but absolutely isn't. Also, I think AI is really going to allow the romance scammers to scale up their operations. As it is today, they have to have dedicated farms of people to maintain these fake relationships and to reach out to new lonely people to exploit. But when you have a chat bot that is close enough to actually initiate a conversation or even manage ongoing conversations, I think it'll really allow the threat actors to scale up their operations.
The other risk I would add to this that I feel like also doesn't get discussed enough is another issue with just AI tools and tools that really, facilitate a lot of automation is that defenders and security teams may become a little too over-reliant on them. And may, mishandle or sit back on what it is, the human factor, right? Being able to review and actually confirm, hey, am I looking at a false positive in reality? Or perhaps, not look at what could be an actual threat just because the automation of the AI itself maybe dismissed it.
Yeah.
And again, that's something that will take time also to define rules of engagement for, as well as train on, which we already have a bit of a cybersecurity skills gap. So adding something, another layer to which we'll need to account for, I think will make things a little bit more challenging. So,
Blake, you want to add some remarks to that, the points made?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think the last part that we still a long way out is really how AI affects data governance, right? How we make sure our internal data is not being used across, competitors or being used at, in, nefarious capabilities, right? So shipping things off to consumer grade, AI thing, softwares or solutions versus a managed enterprise AI solution. It gets lines get very blurry as to when data goes out, who's pushing data where, and making sure that our data is, properly handled so that we're not using our data to go train our competitors, or we're not using our data to go train nation states to understand how to attack us more, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of data governance challenges. I mean, plus on top of that, all the GDPRs, the CCPAs of the world, how are they going to update their provisions to include some of these things as well? I mean, there's a lot of complexities that AI is bringing into that space, and particularly again cloud, because of the speed at which you can enable a lot of these services without that governance. So it's a challenge we're going through right now. We've got a lot of AI use cases that are on my team's kind of backlog to go review, but it's it's a challenge.
Going back to the point made by Rob, the external device, which I wanted to ask him more about, that was his category number 5 in terms of risks. That is to say, well, you have someone within the firm sort of using an external device to plug into the systems. Now, as you elongate your supply chain, which you mentioned, or as you outsource more of your activities, and as you bring on board employees working offsite, perhaps globally, do you therefore increase by definition the nature of the cyber security threat, and how do you cope with that? And that's to all three of you.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I mean, I'm a fully remote employee. I mean, I do have a managed device, but yeah, I mean, I think the coffee shop challenge has always kind of been around there. Going into a coffee shop and connecting back to data centers and doing work. Legacy VPNs have helped with that. But obviously, the last few years have just exponentially, that growth has been exponential with people working like me remote fully, and it's really it's device hygiene. So we do a lot of things around making sure that things have to be managed devices to connect things to our network. You have to be writing the right solutions. Not to throw buzzwords out, that we really push down as far down the zero trust chain that we can, right? I mean, we're not all the way down to the fully implemented zero trust model, but we do that. Like, so anytime we connect to a service, there's multiple checks that happen. So whether it's authentication, logging in with a username and password, there's MFA checks, there's IP checks, there's country checks, there's device health checks, there's, am I, what's the TV, the 24 show, like, am I in Atlanta, right now, and then I try to log in from San Francisco 5 minutes later, like that just doesn't happen, right? So we have a lot of those applied to just
Jake,
about all.
I have a question because I suspect in your days at Georgia Tech, you dealt with it. How effective is VPN? I use it all the time, and many in other organizations do. But I'm in a hotel. I'm not very confident about the nature of the of the connection. I go to VPN and I feel very secure. Is my sense of security misplaced? Be honest.
I'll give you the Scheller answer. It depends, right? So, VPNs are very good at encrypting network traffic, right? So that's when your traffic's going over the wire or wherever it's going. VPNs are very good at doing point to point or maybe point to many point, depending, encrypted communications. Now, on either side of that connection, your laptop or the connection on the other side, there could be lots of risk and challenges that the VPN is not going to solve by itself. But the point of the VPN is to make sure that your traffic is encrypted using some, approved or reliable cipher, and that when you send over, your bank account information, it looks like some garbled text. Now, again, once it gets to its location and once it gets back to your location, the VPN, kind of goes away, and then that brings back all the other layers into play.
Okay, so
you have to ask yourself how much you trust your VPN provider.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting in that hotel and you're using the VPN, then the hotel is not able to look at those packets, but your VPN provider still is.
Should I trust Georgia Tech?
Absolutely. Georgia Tech has excellent cybersecurity stack.
Moving on to the question of regulation and legislation and relating it particularly to AI, which I sense is of concern, and given the answers given, particularly by Matt, about what we can expect from AI. There is legislation pending in Europe, in the European Union, on AI. A lot of people are saying it's premature, it's ill-advised, and there are some folks in various subcommittees of Congress and the House in particular that are looking at it. Obviously, you can imagine how the people line up on that issue of regulation. What are your views on the pending legislation or regulation? Is there a need for more regulation, A, relating to cyber threats more generally, but B, as we move into an AI environment which will impact on cyber threats? Would you like to see more or less, or would you leave it to individual firms to provide their own, every company for itself?
I wouldn't say that we need more or less regulation, but we do need smarter regulation, and we need more unified regulation. So you touched on something there with European Union. So they have one set of things. Our Congress has another set of things. And in the US, we are uniquely positioned to have 50 different states, which can also have their own regulations. So first and foremost, what we need is harmonization. The balkanization of privacy and cybersecurity laws and regulations is a real problem. If you are operating in multiple US states, you might find that you have to comply with multiple conflicting privacy regulations. So one state might say that you have to tell your customers X, and another state might say you're absolutely forbidden from telling customers X. And so it becomes a real mess to try and figure it out. So what we would like to see is a more unified stance from the federal government, as opposed to a bunch of fragmented state regulations. Our worst case scenario is that we have to do something 50 times in 50 different ways. Mm-hmm. So take cyber incident response, for example. There is a piece of legislation called CIRCIA, Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure. And DHS is currently working on the regulations for how US companies will have to report cyber incidents to them. But meanwhile, there are some local regulatory commissions that are wanting to do their own cyber incident reporting. So we could end up in a spot where every time there's an incident, we have to report it to 50 different places in 50 different formats with 50 different requirements for the timing and the information, and it would just be a nightmare. What we really want is just like one voice, one set of things we need to do, but we need for those things to make sense. Cybersecurity regulations are unique, I would say, among other types of regulations in that we have an adversary to deal with. So compare it to like a pipeline or something. We know the physical properties of steel. We know how thick it has to be for a given pressure. We know how much it expands and contracts as it heats and cools. We know all the physical properties of the materials, and they don't change. They're the same now as they were 100 years ago. But with cybersecurity, you have someone actively looking at those controls and looking for a way around them. So what I like to say is that if we build a 6-foot fence, the attackers will build a 7-foot ladder. And it just keeps happening like that. So you have to make sure that your cyber regulations are outcome-based and not specific things to do. Because if you just regulate, you have to have XYZ control. The bad guys are just going to find a way around that particular control. Whereas if your regulation is outcome-based, saying you need to achieve an outcome of doing something, that makes more sense. It gives us more flexibility to try and figure out how to comply with those. Also, when it comes to AI and maybe premature regulations, that touches on another important aspect, which is that it changes every day. That's another reason we needed those outcome-based types of regulations rather than prescriptive steps.
Thank you. Thomas, do you have some observations on the question of regulations? And
my only input there would be, I would, probably put an example of an area where such, let's call it security framework, where it was implemented successfully in a way that was easily consumable, not only at a national level, but a global level. For example, the PCI DSS framework, which guides the security controls that we use to, that would allow a company to process credit card payments, right? There's a lot of what I would consider outcome-based provisions within it, right? Usually work with who would be your auditor on the matter, right, and a qualified QSA expert to inform you whether you met the intent and the provisions included in there. And again, these are standards and frameworks are used globally, really. And to be fair, though, rather than being pushed by a government entity, it's an industry standard, right? So it was pushed mostly by the credit card companies, and again, can be adopted at a global level. So, but it shows that at least it can be done. So
I sense we may be on the edge of massive regulations as the years elapse and as more and more events of a catastrophic nature occur. Am I mistaken in that impression? I mean, you're presenting a corporate view. I assume that Cox, among other companies in the broadband sectors and related fields, are quite present in DC to have their voice heard. Do you have a particular policy preference in terms of the ongoing possible outcomes in the Congress or in regulatory agencies?
There is definitely a stronger push for regulation than we've seen in the past. The government released its national security strategy recently, and it was definitely advocating for more regulation. And we're not opposed to that on principle, but we're concerned that it could be done wrong.
Yeah.
If a lot of states and locals and different competing federal entities even take that message as we're going to do everything in our power to create regulations in whatever our area of influence is, then we just end up with more balkanization and more confusion and more ineffective regulations.
So we're getting close to the end of the time allotted, but I'm looking at some of the questions coming from the audience, and relatedly, one is a question that would move us to, I guess, the market approach to incentivize high-tech companies to build cybersecurity into their products or to their platforms. What are some of these incentives you think could be effective in smaller scale organizations, as opposed to the heavy hand of regulation?
You need both a carrot and a stick. It can't be all stick. So for example, there's a current effort underway for IoT labeling, which is providing some kind of cybersecurity labeling for Internet of Things devices. And the model that's being held up is Energy Star. So today in the US, if you go and buy an appliance, it has an Energy Star rating that tells you how energy efficient your appliance is. And if you buy an efficient appliance, you can get a rebate, typically from your electric company, but that's subsidized by the federal government. So manufacturers are incentivized to create more efficient products because they know that consumers are going to look at that Energy Star rating and it's just like, it's a simple number. And so people are going to pick the best number. And also, of course, there's the financial incentive of those Energy Star rebates that are coming back so that the consumer also has a bigger incentive to do things. So there's an effort underway in the federal government right now to provide something similar for IoT devices, home routers, things like that. It kind of remains to be seen how well it will work or what the actual incentives will be. But I think it's a good model to provide some positive incentive rather than just saying, we're going to punish you if you don't do all these things.
Thomas, Blake, are you in agreement with that approach, pretty much? Now, I have a question that seems unrelated, but it is in a sense, it relates to critical infrastructure. And given the nexus of private sector and public sector on questions of cybersecurity, particularly in the US environment, given the nature of the system, the person is asking the question, who should be in charge of protecting nuclear reactors and such facilities? And I realize Cox probably does not provide, is not in the provision of nuclear energy or other form of energies, but you might be involved in, at some point along that chain. Do you have any sense, any ideas, any assessment of how to respond to such a question based on your experience?
That is a fascinating topic. So communications is somewhat unique in the critical infrastructure space in that we are often the conduit for an attack, whereas other critical infrastructure is just the recipient of the attack. There's two parties, there's the attacker and the victim, but as an ISP, there's an attacker and a victim, and there's us kind of in the middle. So the question is, what can we do or what should we do? And frankly, that needs a lot of clarification, especially when we're talking about nation states. In the physical world, protection from nation states is entirely the responsibility of the government. Whereas on the internet, a lot of the infrastructure is owned by private companies. And there's kind of a victim blaming mentality that goes on that we're really going to have to get past if we want to make any progress. So as an analogy, let's say an airliner was shot down by a foreign fighter jet. Nobody would be blaming the airline for this. Nobody would be asking them, well, why didn't you build an airliner that could take on a fighter jet? Why didn't you make your airliner proof against Sidewinder missiles? Of course not. But when a US company is invaded over the internet by a foreign military, suddenly that company is in front of Congress testifying about why their controls failed. So as it stands now, I think there is too much responsibility put on private industry to defend against foreign government attacks. I think we need a stronger partnership with the federal government, better information sharing, better clarity around what we as private companies can or can't do without incurring liability. As a concrete example, we would like to share more threat intelligence, but we have to do that in a way that ensures that we are protecting everyone's privacy and that we're not stepping on any laws. That's not to say that we want to go hack back, we don't want to go launch attacks, but it would be cool if we had a really positive understanding that we could watch our network for these types of attacks and notify the victims or notify DHS or DOD or whoever is responsible for defending these, without worrying that we're going to be thrown in jail or sued or have some massive regulatory fine.
Well, you raised
add to that, Matt. You also
fascinating
wanna
questions.
Yeah.
And I see my colleague Ani indicating that we have run out of time.
Right.
I want to thank all of you, Blake, Thomas, Matt, for some very stimulating answers to some very broad, overarching questions. I hope there's an opportunity to continue this dialogue. Please stay on as we pursue this afternoon in seeking to narrow down on the zeroing in on some of those issues and questions. I do thank you very much for sharing your insights and your time with us.